Well, good morning. I'm going to be timely and we are going to start on time so we can make sure that we get all the way through this agenda that is before us today. Welcome everyone to the first meeting of the DCYF Oversight Board of the 2026 year. And from both myself and co-chair Diane Leby, also from Lisha and Nicholas, I want to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to this new year. And just wanted to touch base and say that before we kind of go over what's happening today, I wanted to make sure people know that the legislative session is clearly in full swing, even though we're only on day 4 of a quick 60-day session. So I will be exiting at 10:20 to go do my duties in the Early Learning and K-12 Committee, and will gladly pass this over to Co-Chair Levy and also Lisha to take us through the rest of the meeting. So just wanted to make sure folks knew as I disappeared where I was disappearing to. So with that, I just want to share that there are really two areas that we're going to cover today. And one is an area that we're calling emerging issues. And those are issues that the board members have been discussing that have been brought forward between our meetings. And for this portion of the meeting, in order to kind of do some response, we'll be joined by DCYF's Chief Programming Officer, Jenny Hedden. And we've heard from Jenny before, but she will be joining us for that portion of the meeting. And then again, we will also be covering the child welfare workload model report. And so Jenny Hedden will be joined by Brianne Boggs, who is the deputy CFO at DCYF, and they'll present us information on the new model. And the presentation and the discussion that will follow is aligned with one of the board priorities we created in our retreat and in our conversations in 2026, and that is DCYF, worker training and well-being. So we're on our way to kind of focus in on things that we as a group have decided are important for us to dig a little bit deeper into. So I clearly am excited and look forward to thoughtful discussions that are going to happen today. And before I get started and we get started, I would like to pass this over to Lisha so we can do a roll call and approval of the minutes from our December 17th meeting. Good morning, Lisha. You need to unmute first.
Is that fine?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, of course. I really appreciate that. I can't be muted. So I just wanted to say good morning to you and good morning to the board members. For the board member roll call, if you could please unmute yourself and let me know that you are present when I call your name. So Judge Sharonda Amamilo. Anna Armstrong.
Present.
Good morning. Representative Steve Berquist is absent. Katie Byron is absent. Justice Bobby Bridge is absent. Senator Leonard Christian is also absent. Representative Tom Dent.
Representative Dent is here, and I apologize for not being over there, Lisha, but I hurt my knee and it's a long walk, so I'm going to stay over here. But
that
good
makes
to be
sense,
here.
Rep Dent.
Good morning, everybody. So.
Good morning, Rep Dent. Okay, Dr. Bendahan.
Present.
Pamela Javier.
Present.
Good morning, Pamela. Danielle Johnson.
Present.
Good morning. Ruth Kegi.
Present.
Dr. Diane Leby.
Present. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Lois Martin.
Present.
Good morning, Lois. Mary Spruti Garlant.
Present.
Hi, Mary. Stacy Williams.
Present.
Shelley Willis.
Present.
And Senator Claire Wilson.
Present.
Wonderful. So I believe we have quorum.
Well,
Wonderful. So next, I'd like to request that the board members consider approval of the December 17th, 2025 meeting minutes. Does anyone have any edits or feedback to the minutes? Okay, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So move.
Thank you, Ruth. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
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 Terrific. And all those opposed say nay. Any abstentions? With that, the minutes are approved, and I will turn it over now to co-chair Dr. Diane Levy.
Thanks. I am going to make one comment on the minutes before I go on. I was really impressed by the depth of detail in the minutes. I felt like I was back at the meeting when I was reading through them. So thank you. I suspect that's mostly Nicholas who did that, but thank you, Nicholas and Lisha, for all of that. Okay. So with that completed, we can begin our first agenda item, which is a broad brush look at some emerging issues. One purpose of this discussion is to raise concerns expressed by some board members regarding DCYF child safety protocols. Given the complexity of this issue, today's conversation is intended to focus attention on this topic and other emerging issues and to set the stage for more in-depth discussion at the next board meeting. So we realize that this has got a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity to it. And what we're hoping to do is to gather feedback from the board as to questions they have. And we've asked Jenny specifically to walk us through the process specific to early warnings and DCYF follow-up. Specifically, when early warning indicators are identified, but a caregiver opts out of or disengages from services, we'd like to better understand what follow-up is required and within what time frame, and also who is responsible for monitoring ongoing risks for both voluntary versus involuntary services, focusing on key decision points along the way. After her presentation, we've reserved time for more general Q&A. So Jenny, are you here? I don't see her yet.
I hear you.
Oh, she's not here. Well, that's a wrinkle.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I was actually just on with Jenny, and so let's just give her 1 minute, if that's all right with folks. Oh, and Nicholas just let me know that she is here and is just being promoted to panelist. So we should see her shortly.
There she is.
Great. Let's see. Jenny, welcome. You missed your introduction, but I think everybody probably knows you by now.
Yes.
So did you want me to go over the question that we're kind of posing to you again, since you are now present, or did you hear it?
I did not hear it. Sorry, landing back after a child drop off, so at school. So yes.
Well,
Please.
that's important. Yeah, let me just repeat it. So we've asked you to walk us through the process specific to early warnings and DCYF follow-up. Specifically, when early warning indicators are identified, but a caregiver opts out of or disengages from services, we'd like to better understand what follow-up is required within what time frame, and who is responsible for monitoring the ongoing risk for both voluntary versus involuntary services, focusing on key decision points along the way. And after you finish, Jenny, we're going to reserve some time for general Q&A. So go ahead and take it away.
Certainly, happy to. And so I think when you're saying caregiver, and sorry, I'm have been embroiled in talking through child care. So I assume that we're in sort of speaking specifically with the child welfare service engagement. Just to clarify.
Yeah, I'm sorry. One of the things that has really come up is concerns expressed by board members regarding safety protocols at DCYF in the child welfare population. There have also been concerns about child care as well, so we can address both if you'd like, but we just wanted to tee up at least the child welfare safety question first.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So we were actually just having this conversation yesterday. We meet every 2 weeks inside of the Department of Children, Youth, and Families in order to discuss and what we're seeing on critical incidences and to stay really tethered on some of those. What is the data showing us? This is what we're kind of finding as we unpack this is that this topic is as complicated as our families can be, right? And that they show up in a whole variety of ways. So one of the things that we were talking through yesterday is that when we're out with a family and assessing them for safety, we if we find safety threats, our first task that we're going to do is to try to work with the family to develop a safety plan for them. And that can look like a whole host of things, right? That can look like relying on additional family members to have eyes on the child. It could look like us putting in place a service, such as like family preservation services, where there's a worker that is able to go out and a contracted staff person that's able to go out and work with that family. If the safety plan we're getting information that that safety plan is not being sort of adhered to, at that point, if we don't feel like we can remediate any of the safety concerns, we would move forward with attempting a filing of a dependency, right, and removing that child from the home. So, and then that is a court mediated process, I think, as many of you know. So we then have to meet the sufficiency standard for making sure that we have sufficient evidence to remove, and that we have done and offered enough active efforts in those cases, or reasonable efforts, depending on the standard that applies to the case, in order to try to prevent removal of the child from the home. So all of those things are in place. I think one of the things that we are seeing is that a family may engage sufficiently in a safety plan that mitigates threats to the degree that then eventually we close the case, right? If the safety plan is working and there's not enough of a threat to go for removal of the child, then eventually, we exit that case. And what I think happens sometimes is that if that family wasn't really fully ready to make changes, whatever those might be, then we see sort of a falling back sometimes. And that's when we see some of these families kind of coming back into the system on a repeat basis, because they really just aren't quite actually making those changes and having those stick. And I think this is the difference between sort of compliance and engagement, and how do we move families further into readiness and engagement with the services that we are offering. Happy to take questions.
Yeah, and Jenny, one thing I will mention is this: we understand that this is a complicated process and there's a lot of nuance involved, and we would love to get a little bit more in depth at our next meeting. But it is important for us to hear from the board as to what are your general questions, so that we can make sure that we provide, if we need to provide more additional information at the next meeting, that we can get into that complexity. So feel free to raise your hands. I see Judge Amamilo. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Jenny. Good to see you again. I was reading the workload report that was shared, and particularly zoned in on the FRS services when families are engaging voluntarily. The part about where if it gets past 60 days, that the department then starts doing the monthly health and safety visits. They continue if you don't close out a case. How long does that go on until you decide that you need to move towards court intervention? And then an additional follow-on question to that is there some sort of pre-process that you engage in to decide if you have sufficient evidence even before you come to court to see if the court determines, agrees that you have sufficient evidence. I just kind of, it seems like the analysis kind of stopped there at, we just start health and safety visits after the 60 days if you don't close. But how long does that go on, especially in these cases where you're not having families engage?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to make sure, and we can definitely do follow up to outline some of the policies that we have in place about sort of when does case closure happen, or we're moving sort of to another phase, right? Our family voluntary services cases represent some of our most risky cases that we have in the department, right? Because the children are remaining in the home during that service period. And hence the voluntary nature of that service, right? At a certain point, the parent can decide, or parents can decide to stop participating in that process. And so I don't know that we have a great answer in terms of like, and we could go look at our data to say kind of like how long are those cases lasting in terms of those family voluntary services cases? Because it is, I would imagine, all over the map. And I welcome Danielle also to jump in as well, because she's on the ground serving some of these families a little bit closer, so can give maybe some more specifics on that. If we have concerns, right? So we're needing to be assessing safety threats, risks and threats throughout the life of the case while it is with us. And if we, at any point in the case, either it could be in the Child Protective Services investigation or FAR case, or it could be in Family Voluntary Services, if we feel that those threats are rising to the level of where we need to pursue removal, we would do a safe child consult. So that was a new practice change that went into effect with House Bill 1227, which is an opportunity for our individual social workers to staff a case with other social workers and supervisors to ensure that we can meet legal sufficiency. We also, after we take a look at it internally, will then staff that, of course, with our Attorney General's office as well before we are moving forward to court. And so we're getting sort of two bites of the apple of looking at that case and making sure that we have done everything that we need to do, and that the case truly meets the standard. We may have some situations, Judge, and I'm sure you see these, right, that are kind of on the bubble, on the line. And if we feel very strongly that there is a risk that we cannot mitigate with that safety plan, we will move forward with filing. And then, right, it is ultimately up to the judicial discretion and interpretation of the legal standard to say, did we meet that or not, in order to have the child be removed.
Just before you go to the next person, just as a follow-on, I think you hit the nail on the head. We need to see where that bubble is. Like, what is the trend about how long that's taking? Obviously, it's going to be different, but how long it's taking before these consults ultimately end up in bringing it before the court before something happens. So, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we can probably have more follow along there, but I want to make sure I leave time to get to the other hands.
Sure.
And before I go on to you, Ruth, I wonder, Danielle, did you want to add anything there?
I would say, just anecdotally, what is being seen in the field is cases do remain open past those 60 days. There are numerous cases that I know of that they are open basically until they can be closed. And doing a safe child consult, to Jenny's point, and going before an AAG to discuss potential removal or filing for dependency, we do have to meet that legal threshold, right? And so if there is an investigator who is working with the family and the family is not engaging, the potential does exist that that case might get closed out, either as unfounded, or I don't believe the term is inconclusive, but it's basically we do not have enough evidence to say one way or another if something happened or didn't happen. But if we don't have families that are engaging, we can't get the information to go to the Safe Child Consult, to go to the AAG to meet the legal threshold for having dependency.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Ruth.
Thank you. And it is, it's a very familiar topic that we, Jenny, have talked about many times before, and I really appreciate the work that you and the department continue to do to keep kids safe. But one of the issues that has been recurring is that every family has different issues. I understand that. But when families come before the department repeatedly and are, the caseworker has to go back and back and back, is there any threshold or increased attention that gets focused based on the number of times a case comes back to the department?
Yes, we're also have discussed this quite a bit because I think that these types of cases really represent a true challenge to all child welfare systems in the nation, really. We have these families that have real significant challenges in front of them, and often, one additional challenge heaped onto them can be what sends them sort of into sort of that significant downward spiral, ultimately leading to involvement with the department. So, one of the things that we do is that our safety assessment that we have does allow or does take into account essentially what we would call chronicity, right? More than multiple referrals. Does sort of rate that family higher in terms of risk. I think the challenge that we have is that when that goes over to the legal standard for sufficiency for removal, history cannot really come into play. It is about immediate threat to the child. That's what we're really having to meet. So I think there is a real question about how do we handle what kind of service array offerings are made to families that are in that high risk or moderately high risk sort of category for us, but whom don't meet the standard for removal. There has to be a suite of services, right? And some of the challenges that we have, and you saw this in the request that we had, our decision package, as well as what was funded for the governor's office in the governor's proposed budget, is some funding to try to shore up some of the service offerings that we might do for families. And some of the services that we want to offer families at that point, unfortunately, we don't provide those services, and there's can be significant wait lists, funding issues, et cetera. Right. So things like substance use treatment, right? Things like significant poverty alleviation, those really come from other systems, and we see real challenges around access, right, for substance use treatment, for behavioral health, mental health treatment. And so I think that's, this is the question that we're having, and we're actually going back and doing some review of the literature and some discussion with sort of what is happening at the national level. Where do we know and have evidence about how to handle these sort of chronically neglecting families? And probably the answer is that we need a much longer time to work with them, right? So these families this is not going to be a 60-day fix. This is going to be probably a multi-year involvement with this family. And right now, they have to voluntarily agree to that kind of commitment with us, because if there's no dependency in place, there is no court oversight. And all we're doing is really trying to engage with and get that family to be engaged in the services that we can offer to them.
Okay, Shelley.
You may have already answered my question, but I'm going to take a stab at it anyway. From our humble place on the front line, we're certainly seeing a greater number of voluntary services rather than dependencies, which is supported by different laws and support systems that are not always adequate to meet the family's needs. And so my question is, how's DCYF assessing the impact of this shift in child safety? It sounds like you are definitely taking note and the chronicity of generational abuse through many families. But the service consistency and the long-term family outcomes I'm concerned about, because voluntary systems aren't adequately resourced to meet the need, especially in our more rural areas of the state. Is there anything we can do to help address that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just note that one thing, and this is, kind of putting my former chief financial officer hat on, one challenge I think that we face as a system is that our funding for services, whether those are provided, in a family voluntary case or a child protective services case, or even after we're in a situation where the child has been removed and we're in dependency, we have a finite box of funding for that does not change with the number of families that we are seeing or with the depth of need that we're seeing from families. So we're having to make resource allocation choices all the time in terms of how to fund those programs. And so you're absolutely right. So one of the areas we would really like to see is continued investment in what we call our combined in-home services array, and in particular have very, very much interest in how do we do a better job of building out the service network in rural communities, in our tribal communities. And so you have seen some, for example, requests for essentially interest in funding specific for example, tribal providers. And I think really still working through the rural side. I was out recently in our Aberdeen office, and we don't have service providers in some of those counties, Pacific County, right? And so how are we really building up a network, which may mean that we need to pay differently, for example, and have different rates associated with that, buy more ongoing capacity, even though there's a small number of cases that end up being in that community. So we're definitely committed to continuing to build out our service array. And then again, I would just point to that our families often want services that we are not the provider of, right? And so I think we also have to work with our system partners like Healthcare Authority to make sure that their networks are sufficient because they see the same lack of providers for things like substance use and behavioral health out in some of those rural communities. And that's really what our families need and would want to engage with.
I would like to add that one more thing quickly. Thank you. For us, prevention is a stronger approach than intervention. And if family resource centers across the state could work closer with DCYF and get those services to families as early as possible, as long as possible, I'd love to talk more about how to help make that happen.
Yes, absolutely. We really definitely recognize our family resource centers as a kind of critical backbone that we would like to work with. And that's very much in thinking about how we would do, for example, a community-based pathway for prevention and potentially, right, for family reconciliation service type work as well. And that's very much in our plan. And I do want to say a spot of good news, which is that we are approved right now with our Family First Preservation Services Act prevention plan with the feds. And so right now it's really working on what does that infrastructure look like so that we can begin claiming our Title 4E federal funds in order to fund prevention, which I think will be a real game changer in being able to work with families more proactively before they come to the child welfare system.
Lois.
Thank you very much, Diane. Jenny, I have a question about DCYF's governance framework. How are you using that to evaluate the Keeping Families Together Act, and who is accountable for reviewing the outcomes and reporting that to the public? And then my follow-up question to that is there any type of formal oversight mechanism to assess whether the law is meeting its intended outcomes or creating unintended harm?
Thank you. So one of the things that we did initially when House Bill 1227 was passed was we started, again, a group of us that internally look at our data on a really regular basis. So we are tracking a number of data points. We're looking at our rates of removal. We're looking at how many intakes that we're getting, both sort of what's coming in terms of intakes and how many screen in for a CPS response. And then we are also looking at critical incident data. And like I said, we have been meeting regularly an internal group of leadership to review that data and stay on top of it. For example, we were very, we were breaking that data down even to the regional level to see, are there differences, amongst regions in terms of removal rates, et cetera. Initially, we saw, right, as the system tried to kind of ingest some of these legal changes, significant changes in our trends around removals, et cetera. And then that has significantly stabilized, and especially after 6109, Senate Bill 6109 was passed, we have essentially seen largely a return to the rates of removal that we had prior to House Bill 1227. And so we've been keeping a very close eye on it. And we also then present and have that data available. And I think you've all seen that we have quarterly data that is available, and I'm happy to make sure that you have the link to that on our public-facing website. So we make all of that information available. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the legislature is the one that passes laws and decides our policy. And so, you see some. We worked closely on Senate Bill 6109 to address some of the concerns that we were having around how 1227 was being implemented. You see more, again, another piece of agency request legislation from us this year to continue to correct it. And then ultimately it's in front of the legislature for a final decision on sort of where we land the policy. I think the challenging thing that I have seen in this space is that there's a lot of conversation about sort of, should we change the legal sufficiency standards, right, again? And just two pieces of sort of commentary. One is that I just want us to all think that, or be aware of, that when we have seen changes in the law, and feel free for those of you who have personal experience with this, as sitting on the bench or in our offices, that it can take a good 12 to 24 months for the totality of our system to really understand and be able to implement those changes, right? So we made a change, and then it takes a while to ingest, and if we make another change, and so we're always thoughtful to sort of say, let's see what happens as the system sort of stabilizes and is able to understand how to implement the law, because sometimes what we see in the beginning is not what we see once we're a little further into implementation. And that's a pretty standard thing that we see when we're implementing any kind of change in a law, right? So that's sort of thing one. Thing two is that the legal standard is, at the end of the day, a fairly broad instrument, right? It's hard to make it apply to some families and not others. It has to apply across the board. And so what we're sort of seeing is, again, we were talking about earlier, that what we're concerned about is sort of the subset of families that we see that are high risk, but not in that place where we're yet meeting the removal standard. I think there's a question that we need to ask ourselves, right? And this is what I think we're all collectively wrestling with, is we could bring more of those children into care. And that may have an impact on the number of critical incidences and ultimately, right, child near fatalities and fatalities. And the flip side of that is that it's not just bringing in those families, it's probably bringing in thousands more families in with their children in out-of-home care. And we have to wrestle with that, right? Like all child welfare systems, in terms of, are we over removing or under removing? And both have consequences, right? And I want us to be aware of both sides of the consequence, right? And so one of the things that we are actually doing some analysis on is, if we did some of those changes, if there are further changes in the law or the standard, how many families would that potentially impact? Because I think it's important to have that conversation, right? If there's a change in the law and that results in 2,000 more children being in out-of-home care, is that an outcome we want as well, right, for the state? And we take child fatality and near fatalities extremely seriously. And that's why we look at that data regularly, and we do fatality reviews to understand and learn how where the system may have improvements that it wants to make. And so we're trying to do both of those. So hopefully that was responsive to your questions, and happy to continue with others if needed.
Lois, did you have a follow-up to any of that, or are you good?
I do. And Diane, you probably knew that I would. Thank you. So then, based on what you were sharing, Jenny, so what metrics have you adopted? Has the agency adopted, I should ask, that measures whether the law has been successful? Let me rephrase. What metrics has the agency adopted that officially measures the success of the law, and as it relates to what's happening in real time? And I know that Senate Bill 6109 did help the field some, but I'm also curious about looking at the metrics, and as well as are folk feeling as if their hands are being tied to help children?
Well, I can speak to the metrics, and then I don't want to speak on behalf of all of our caseworkers. I think that there's probably a variety of feelings across the field staff around it. But in terms of metrics, the things that we are tracking, right, as I stated before, is really looking at what does removal look like? What is our percentage of children that are being removed? How does that relate to the number of calls that we're getting and investigations and family assessments that we're doing? And then we are also looking at re-referral, right? So in a child welfare system, we want to say, like, if you are potentially if you're kind of under removing, what can happen, right, is that you then see those families come back in. I think that was Ruth Kagi's question of, like, those families come back in because we didn't ultimately meet their needs. So we want to look at both. Those metrics are really important to look at together. What does our removal rate look like, and how often are they coming back in? And so we are keeping a close eye on that. And we actually have a project. We are part of a national project on this called Grow the Green, which is that space of saying, like, we want to be hitting that sweet spot, right, between not over removing and not under removing. And those metrics help us know if we are in that target.
Okay.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead,
Diane. No, that was it for now.
Okay. So I'm going to take the facilitator's prerogative to throw in a question myself, if that's possible. So I'm trying to understand, Jenny, you said something that really caught my attention about these families who tend to be more highly chronic with their recurrent referrals. You said during your safety plan analysis, you can take that information into account. However, when we go to the courts and look at dependency, it still has to basically meet that legal definition, which doesn't take that history into account. And that strikes me as something that's a little bit of an oversight in the way the law may be intended. And I wondered if you had any ideas on what, to me, when I look at those recurrent offenders, that really is a number that kind of gets you, like how many times they've been referred in. So that strikes me as an area that should be taken into high consideration when you're considering whether or not to try and pull those kids out into dependency or keep them safe. You mentioned putting more services in, but I also worry about the impact on those kids that are left in these unsafe homes, right? Even if it's not a fatality or near fatality, they're getting significant morbidity sometimes in these homes. So question, I guess, in my mind is, how would you fix that loophole?
Well, and I'm looking, knowing that I have a judge on the list who may have some thoughts as well. So I'm happy to give it 1 second, and I would prefer, and then might hand it over. So there's two pieces, right? One is sort of a legal issue of how much can you bring history, right, into, and should it be considered just from a sort of legal standard? And I will not answer that question because I am not an attorney, but happy to provide and follow up. And I think our judge will help us out with that as well. From a philosophical standpoint, right? I think the challenge is, how do you let history inform you without it dooming people, right? Without it not allowing for families to actually make changes, right? And I think we have to have both. We have to hold both in tension as a system. I think if I might switch out of child welfare and think about our juvenile rehabilitation world, we have a similar conundrum when we are classifying, for doing a security classification for someone. How much do I take their history, their crime type? Maybe they've run from a program before, maybe they've gotten in fights before. How much do I take that into account, which we call sort of their static risk, versus how do I take into account their current circumstances? And that's more their dynamic risk, something that would actually change, that the family can actually make progress in. And we're trying to balance both of those all of the time. And so it is tricky. We've had these conversations about, is there a place for in the law to have a consideration of history? And I think you get into a pretty tricky space pretty quickly. But I see hands up, and so I just want to pause there and see if you have anything else to add, or anyone else on the board.
So maybe I'll let Judge Abamilo answer, and then we'll come to you, Ben. Is that okay?
I just want to make sure it's okay with him.
Oh, yeah, yeah, of course. Please go
Okay.
ahead.
First, I think that for the petitions that I see, the department does a very good job of including all of that history that they've been working with the families on that is not prejudicial. The department has done a very good job of not putting in, well, it improved over time. I've been here in Thurston County doing this for over 20 years now, but things that are unfounded are no longer in petitions. These are things that were brought in for investigation, work has been done. And so the whole history actually comes in, even if it's a new case, the prior dependency, if there was a prior dependency on other children, that is also in this new petition to give that background information. And so part of what we're looking at is whether or not reasonable efforts have been have been applied to avoid removal, to mitigate the need for removal. And that's really the question on the table is, we have all this history, but have the things been done that should have been done, that were available to offer to families? And then, of course, the piece that Jenny talked about, whether or not a parent engaged. Sometimes we get parents who will say, I've done all I'm going to do until I'm court ordered to do something, to do more. And the department their hands are tied. They have to file because the concern has not been mitigated, and they have tried a number of things, and the parent just gets to a point where they've decided that they are going to wait for a court order. And so then it's this that's a lot of the times we see when a parent just refused to engage, and a family refused to engage, and other family members sometimes will not wrap around because there's just been this scorched earth sort of relationship between family members and parents not wanting extended family members to be those supports. And sometimes being involved in the court process, then they all of a sudden they are aware that that could have been the support, that the extra piece that they needed, someone else to talk to, or they get sent to someplace like Miss Willis's programs, and then they start to realize that this is not the enemy trying to take your children or take your authority. It is a person who cares about your future and your family, and you've been experiencing some generational harms or some generational traumas or some just life problems that you haven't been able to hack and solve yourself. And so now you're at this place where you have to have court intervention. So we do get all of that history. Thank you.
Thank you. Ben.
Hi, Jenny. Nice to see you this morning. Thanks for coming by. I have a very, I think, a simple question. It's not clear to me from looking at the critical incident data that there's any relationship between 1227 and the rise in critical incidents. And I don't know if your review of the data, you have a comment about it, but the rise in critical incidents predated the signing of the law and certainly predated the implementation of the law. So what we're looking at, it's from my perspective anyway, is a trend that started a long time ago, and I don't see any causal relationship between that trend and the passage and implementation of 1227. I don't know if your internal reviews would shed any light on that. If you have a comment, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, I think that the challenging, so we definitely have been taking a look at our critical incident. I mean, obviously we look at our critical incidences very closely and do reviews. And one of the things that we are looking at is sort of like, and you also have to look at it uh, in terms of sometimes some of these families, right? We may have seen them before 1227, after 1227, after 6109, right? And so we are trying to look for some of those trends, and that's certainly what our critical incident reviews are looking for is like what are is there again any kind of systems work. We've stated, right, very clearly that we see the impact of fentanyl or high potency synthetic opioids, right, significantly. And some of those trends around critical incidences really mirror trends that we were seeing around opioid deaths in general or even emergency system responses. And you can kind of see that even in local data trends as well. I think the other piece that we're seeing, and you'll hear about this, I'll just do a moment to plug we had a work session or a webinar that we did with some of our frontline staff to sort of talk about the impact that these cases that have high potency synthetic opioids and I'm happy to give you the link to that. It is on our website and our YouTube channel. And one of the things that came forward was in addition to fentanyl, and I think this is important to mention, we also sort of see a fundamental change in people's trust in government, I think, going on as well, right? And so we're having more situations where families are refusing to let us in the door, refusing to talk to us, refusing to participate in services. And I do think that there may be something kind of more societal about that. And that is a change that we sort of hear from our frontline workers. And so I definitely think there are broader societal trends beyond the legal changes that we've had in Washington State that we are seeing that impact these. And we did see a significant drop, especially when 1227 was implemented in the number of kids coming into out-of-home care, right? Which presumably is what the law was designed to do. And we have seen moderation of that trend. So again, in trying to hit that sort of sweet spot around removal, we are still very much trying to dial that in. And that is also going to have an impact potentially, right? When you don't remove a child, they are obviously at risk for a critical incident. And so but it's a very small number, right? And so I think it is difficult to make large conclusions off of a very small number of cases that are extremely tragic and horrible, and we want to be able to handle those well as a system. But trends are difficult because we start to slice and dice that data, and now you're talking about 3 cases, and you really cannot make a trend off of that.
Very small numbers. I would one last comment, and the critical incidence trend is very, very different than the child fatality trend as well. There is no clear increase in child fatalities, and again, that rise in critical incidents predated the law. So those are just things for people to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And I just want to note the time. We're down to about 10 minutes. And I also want to make sure that if people have questions about early learning and childcare and some of the issues that are going on right now with that they have time to ask questions about that as well. Danielle.
Yes, I'll be very brief. So going back to the point about chronicity, so chronicity, I think, we kind of touched on this, but it is only a risk factor. It's not considered a safety factor. And another point to take into consideration is I am fairly confident that there is no definition or agreement about what constitutes serious chronic neglect, which is another issue that workers tend to run into. And then to the point about 1227, in the field, anecdotally, what we were seeing is when this was signed in 2021, I believe it was, courts started interpreting that law, even though it didn't go into effect for another 18 months to 2 years, I believe. So we were seeing the effects of that bill prior to it actually being signed into effect in July.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Very helpful. Okay, Senator Wilson.
Yeah, I just want to thank Jenny for being here, but also want to share with the board that on January 27th, the Human Services Committee will be doing a work session on child welfare, and the work session will be part of it will be Casey Family Programs, who will give us the national perspective as well as the state perspective related to child welfare systems. They are housed in their national office out of Seattle, but nationally work in all 50 states and help with direct services, help with public policy resources, research. They do analysis, and I've been chatting with them over the last year, so they'll be joining. And if you're free to join through TBW, that's great, but we'll also send the link because it is archived for on-demand viewing. So just want to make sure folks are aware of that. And, changes in legislation can only occur during a legislative session. And so it is critically important that we have these conversations and that we're able to make adjustments when we're in session to make sure that the intent and the impact of our legislation is what we expect it to be. And implementation is always a challenge, and I'm appreciative of the work everyone does to make sure kids and families are safe. So just wanted to make sure folks knew about the work session on the 27th. Thank you.
Thank you. Jenny, I don't see any questions, but did you want to make any comments about how things, there's Lois. She's got a question. Go ahead, Lois.
I do. I wanted to ask Jenny, because as I don't know how many people on the oversight board know this, but a number of childcare providers, whether family or even those who work in centers, are being doxxed by individuals around the work, and the accusations of fraud and quite frankly, the lack of protections for the field. I'm wondering, because anyone can make a public records request at this time and receive the personal information of staff that work in centers. So I want to know what the department plans to do to help protect the field, as well as to push back stronger on the fraud allegations. One of the things in reviewing the December report on childcare overpayments, it talks about where the issues happen, but it doesn't talk about the funds that are recouped, which I know in working in the field, that happens quite a bit. So are there plans to share all that information to help counter this narrative? So about the fraud piece as well as protections for the field.
Yes, absolutely. So a couple of things that are sort of forthcoming. So I will first of all say that if you have more interest in some of the child care conversation, we have a presentation happening this afternoon in front of the Senate K-12 and Early Learning Committee, where our Assistant Secretary Nicole Rose and Assistant Secretary Ruben Reeves will be there talking about what we have in terms of fraud prevention metrics, and we are happy to also come to the board at a later date if interested, or do individual briefings if folks are interested as well in understanding a little bit more about what we have in place. So thank you, Lois, for your question. We are obviously working very closely with our Attorney General's office in terms of what information must we provide, either for just generalized requests or in a public disclosure request to the department. And so as we have requests for information on individual providers, we are working with our Attorney General to determine what we are required legally to provide and where protections might be in place. You are correct. There are not a lot of protections in place on the information related to childcare centers or family homes, et cetera. Those would require changes in statute in order to protect that information from disclosure. And so we're again making sure that we can really follow the law closely. We have a very robust system in place, I think, as you were also sort of alluding to, Lois, to identify not just fraud, but also, right, we have situations where there are overpayments that happen, and those can originate through all sorts of situations. Often they are mistakes that are made, right, either in billing or even by us as the department in terms of there being sort of, confusion about what should have been paid out at a given moment. And if we identify those overpayments, we go forward with collecting on those overpayments. And so for providers, they have definitely experienced that, right? Where we are identifying an overpayment and have collected on those. And those overpayments are referred to our Department of Social and Health Services Office of Financial Recovery. And they do a whole host of those kinds of overpayment recoveries, both for us and as well as for DSHS. Fraud has a level of intent to it, right? So you can have a larger set of overpayments, and there may be a subset of those that, and what we can see in our data is a very small subset of those are what we would call sort of actual fraud, right? And for those, if we suspect that their fraud may be occurring, we are referring those over to the Office of Financial Accountability, which is over in also in DSHS, right? And they actually are equipped to investigate and to make a determination of if fraud occurred or not. And they will also make a criminal prosecution referral as part of their process if they're looking into it. And again, they do that on behalf of multiple public benefit programs, not just childcare. I think it's important to note, so on the provider side of the house, so in addition to some of those mechanisms, the two pieces that we are really have in place to identify and prevent any kind of fraud is, first of all, we are doing unscheduled in-person licensing visits once a year. So if you are a licensed childcare, either home or center, you will get an unannounced visit at some point through that year. And if children are not present, right, because you can imagine a situation, say you have like kind of essentially an in-service day or something else happening and there are no children present, we will come back and do another visit to see when children are present so we can see how the facility is operating with children present. In addition to those annual on-site visits, we also conduct audits of our transactions, and we conduct audits both of families as well as of providers. And in 2025, we had over 6,000 childcare providers and over 2,000 family, friend, and neighbor providers. And we audited almost 2,000 of them. And so that represents a sort of audit sample of 23%, which is pretty significant. If for those of you who are familiar with statistics, right? Usually you can sometimes see samples of much smaller. And in fact, that's what we see when the state auditor audits is a smaller sample size than that. And out of those 23%, those 2,000 that we audited, only 14 ended in a referral to that Office of Fraud and Accountability group. And out of that group, we had no cases that were prosecuted and no cases that were convicted for fraud during that same time. So very small numbers is what we are seeing. We actually see a slightly higher rate in terms of cases that we send to that OFA on the family side of the house than we do on the provider side of the house. And that could be situations like, for example, that a family is not forthcoming about the composition of their family, the number of family members they have, for example, or changes in income, for example. So we see those types of cases as well. And I will probably stop there because I see hands.
Well, I'm just gonna just mention, Jenny, if it's okay with you, we might just go an extra few minutes because you have the next presentation as well, if that's okay.
You're stuck with me for quite a while this morning, so yes, happy to
I think
flex.
we can continue. I'm not sure you answered the second part of Lois's question about childcare workers' safety.
Yes, we have provided messages, to our childcare workforce I think that the challenge for us is that clearly we are concerned, right? We do not want a situation where anyone is being harassed or feels threatened. And we have really encouraged our childcare providers to reach out and work with their local law enforcement in those situations because they're much better equipped to deal with those. In addition, we have been reaching out to providers that maybe kind of more vulnerable to those. We made sure that our licensing staff have made contact with with the providers that may be concerned, so that they can make sure that they're getting any kind of technical assistance or support from the department as well.
Thank you, Lois. Did you have a follow-up?
I do. So messaging is inadequate when it comes to protections. And so my follow-up question is, when family home providers have the option to opt out of having their personal information shared, in light of the threats, because I know that Senator Wellman had Bill 5926, which was set to just simply protect the private information of the child care center workforce. In light of the threats that I know DCYF is aware of, why is there no push to request that this information be temporarily withheld for the protection of the workforce?
Well, I think we spoke to this, and I would be happy to provide sort of a written response in coordination with our Attorney General in terms of the ability to have an expectation of privacy for this information. So we ultimately have to follow the law in terms of, and for Washington State, unless a record is expressly called out in statute as not needing to be shared, we have a legal obligation to share that information. We have, I believe, hopefully you know, Lois, we have explained to providers how they can manage and where they can manage their own information, because there's a variety of places, right, that information may be available to the public. And so we have had that conversation, but we have to follow the law in terms of what information has to be provided publicly. And I recognize that can put our childcare providers in a tough spot with the situation that we are in right now. And again, would just really encourage our childcare providers who have a safety concern to be working with their local law enforcement about that safety concern, because that is really the most appropriate the entity that is set up to respond to those concerns.
Senator Wilson?
Thanks. I just did have a response. And Lois, I don't know if you've seen Senator Hansen's bill related to safety and entrance. So you might look at that. I don't have a bill number, but I could get that to Lisha and we could send that on. That may be something you want to take a peek at. My question specifically, Jenny, was around once a family child care provider is licensed and they be kind of launch their business, is there a period of time that it takes, and how do families find childcare, and how does childcare fill up, and what do we see when you get a license and suddenly do you have 12 people at your door, or how is it that especially new providers that come online actually get service supported and have families find them, and what's kind of realistic for that time frame?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. And I think I probably am not well positioned. I think we might want to hear from a childcare provider directly, but I can at least tell you how we try to help families find childcare, right? So we have a couple of different options. First of all, when you call our call center and are getting sort of first approved, right, for working connections, we will make sure that you know some of the places that you can look for childcare. So obviously we have a contract with Childcare Aware, which is where, again, so I have a 10-year-old now, so I haven't had to search for childcare for a little while, but I am relatively close to it. And so I was actually would go on the Child Care Aware website, which will let you know and search for childcare in your area. So that would be one place that families could potentially find you, right? Oh, sorry, Senator.
And no, and I want to stop you because I'm not necessarily talking about families. What I'm kind of talking about is we have a lot of new providers, and I think we've had a lot in the news around providers without children in care. And one of the things that I know is a new site or a new center or a new home, there's a process that people go through, just like a new business. So what is something that DCYF would expect, and when would you maybe wonder if there were kids in care or not in care? What would cause you, uh, once you license, then you just let people go for a year? Or how is it that you know they're actually children in care, if that makes sense?
Yes. So let's break this apart into two pieces, right? One is that I want to recognize that we license all child care providers, regardless of if they take child care subsidy. So, right. So from the licensing perspective, we are sort of setting you up and saying, go forth, right, and serve children. And we don't know if you as a provider are going to choose to serve families that are on subsidy or not. That is a business decision by that child care provider. Again, we will go out and see you annually just to make sure that regardless of if they're subsidized children on subsidy or not children on subsidy, you have the safety and other licensing things in effect ongoing to make sure that all children that are in licensed care are safe, right? Ultimately is our first goal for licensing. Then you may take subsidy as well, right? And so then we are sort of watching to see what, how many children you're taking with subsidy. And there is a high preponderance of licensed providers that take subsidy, children on subsidy, but not all. And so I do think it is a tale of a bit of, two stories there to some extent. And certainly, if we have a situation where, say, we again arrive at a child care center, we don't find children on site, we're going to have a conversation about why that might be, right? There could be all sorts of reasons that is happening. They just opened, to your point, and are still kind of building up their ranks. Although, if my friends are any indication, and my sister who is searching for childcare right now, I think we find those people pretty quickly because there is such a demand for childcare out there for our working parents. The second piece, but then we would obviously again come back and see. And then the other thing that we would potentially do if we're concerned about that is compare to how we are paying, right? So we don't want a situation, right, where we're not finding kids on site and we are making significant payments. And in those kinds of situations, we would likely conduct an audit and or refer that over to that Office of Fraud and Accountability so they can kind of figure out like what's actually going on here. The last thing I'll just say is that, again, as somebody who pretty recently purchased childcare, I purchased a lot of childcare that my son did not use because he was sick a lot. And right. And I have seen that even in my son's K-12 system, programs, right, is that I can show up on any given day and there could be two kids in that classroom because the flu is making its way through, right? And so, or we're on winter break and families are taking breaks, right? Those are choices that families make in terms of their actual utilization of care, and that can lead to some of those kind of I think mismatches from a public perspective. And I think for those of us who haven't purchased childcare recently, kind of can forget how much unused care we all ended up purchasing based upon what was going on for our individual families.
Thank you very much.
Lois, I feel like maybe we should move on. I don't want to make sure. Do you have a quick question or?
No, I just wanted to share that bill number is 5906. And just to point out that Senate Bill 5906, that it does put the burden, the administrative burden on the provider or the small business itself as a general bill across for any public facing business. It's totally different than what we're discussing right now. So I just wanted to point that out. And that's all I have for now.
Okay, Thank you. Thank you, Jenny, very much for coming in and agreeing to talk about these emerging issues. I also, in my mind, as you were speaking, I sort of sense that we need a little bit more of the data in our presentation, maybe next time. In my mind, I'm thinking of an algorithm, there's the word, algorithm, where we see the decision points and exactly kind of what the percentages are of what happens where. That might be helpful. But now I'm going to turn it back over to Senator Wilson for the next portion. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, and thanks, Dr. Leby, and thanks, Jenny, for part one. And we're getting ready for part two. So I want to welcome back Jenny, but also want to welcome Brianne Boggs, who's the Deputy CFO at DCYF, and they, as I said earlier, are going to give a presentation on the new child welfare model workload report. And we have, again, some time reserved at the end for Q&A. Always want to thank you for being ready and being willing to come in front of us and share information and get our questions answered and hopefully give you some thoughts as well. So with that, I'd ask you to unmute yourselves, take it away, and look forward to seeing board members at our next meeting. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator Wilson. Good luck today. So we actually do have a PowerPoint presentation for this portion, and I know we will definitely reserve time at the end for questions, but also would encourage that as we're on a particular slide, we are happy to take questions as they occur as well. So with that, let's maybe we can go into our presentation mode. So we can go to the next slide. I have, thank you, Nicholas, for running slides for me, I believe. Oh, Nicholas, I don't know. It's not in presentation mode. I'm not sure if you intended to be. There we go. Yay. I figured it was a little bit of a lag. So I just want to introduce sort of how we got here, right? This has been a long time coming, work on workload for DCYF, and I would normally have some of our staff here from the child welfare side, but they are on leave today. So you're getting our Deputy CFO, Brianne Boggs, to talk you through this today. So just want to point out that originally in 2019, there was legislation looking at what we should do around workload, and we have the RCW reference here as well. And we also had House Bill 2008, which we will talk about here briefly in a minute, about that added child protective services workers to our forecasting process. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means here in a couple of slides. In 2021, there was funding for a time study to occur. We had not done a workload study in, I think, well over a decade by the time that this was actually funded. So our first step was to hire Public Consulting Group, PCG, to come in and complete a time study. What that means is that for a period of time, I think we ended up ultimately extending it to about a month, we were actively collecting data from caseworkers across our state system that looked at how much time does it take to complete tasks that are required by policy or RCW for child welfare cases. That time study ultimately wrapped up. One of the challenges of when we conducted that time study was that certain policy changes had not gone into full effect. So as you can note by this time frame of when we were doing the study, we were just at the kind of cusp of House Bill 1227. We also had significant court cases happening at the Supreme Court level that created significant changes to our Indian Child Welfare Act and expectations for that. And those policies had not been negotiated with tribes at the time that the time study was completed. So in 2024, we held a series of work groups in all 6 regions to essentially say, you know, where do we think the time study was not fully reflecting the requirements of some of the new policies that we were seeing, and how would we incorporate those that into a full-blown workload model. So we may need to go in and adjust, for example, the amount of time it is taking to complete active efforts because there's additional active effort requirements. And so we went in and actually altered the time study results in this new workload model based upon those work groups that were held into 2024. We completed this modeling, the sort of the math problem side of the house with the workload in 2025, and that resulted in a decision package to the governor's office and the legislature this last summer in the fall that we submitted, and we were largely funded in the governor's budget for that ask, and we will be giving more detail on that request here later in the presentation. We can move to the next slide. So I think it is important, before we sort of launch fully into what did the workload study say, is to talk a little bit about how does staffing work today, currently, for DCYF, because I think there's a lot of confusion that I see on this particular topic. So we only receive additional staff through essentially 2 mechanisms. One is that we can request them in the form of a decision package. And the second is that after that House bill that I spoke about, House Bill 2008, passed in 2018, child protective workers were added to our forecasting process. So what that means is that the Caseload Forecast Council provides a forecast of our intakes, our screened in intakes, and we then get our staffing levels adjusted up or down for those screened in intakes. And currently, that workload standard that's used for those child protective services is based upon how many new screened in intakes a month can a worker take. And right now, what we are funded for in the forecast is to have no more than 8 new screened in intakes per month per worker. That is at the statewide sort of average level. And so I always caveat this to say individual worker experiences will be different than that, because it is based on a whole host of things that could be happening at a regional level or regional staffing that is happening. So that may not guarantee that that's the experience of every individual worker, but that is essentially how the math works for getting new staff. We can go to the next slide. So I just want to highlight that this graph is showing sort of our current staffing levels, and the blue line is our budget, right? So how many FTEs, full-time equivalents, is our language here, and essentially that means, like, say you had a half-time worker and a half-time worker, that would equal 1 FTE. How many FTEs are we actually funded for? And the orange line represents how many FTEs we actually spent in any given state fiscal year. And the reason I have this chart is, first of all, to show that our overall funded FTE levels have increased between state fiscal year 20 and state fiscal year 25. And that represents investment by our governor and the legislature in additional staffing. The other reason I'm showing this chart is that you can see, especially, I think, coming off of the pandemic and in state fiscal year 22 and 23, we struggled to actually staff to the level that we were funded for, right? So we wanted to make sure that we really could get back to sort of full staffing levels, and have been doing focused efforts on retention of staff. And you see that sort of start to pay off in state fiscal year 24, where we actually were overspent. Shh, don't tell anyone. We managed that at the agency level, but we were actually overstaffed, and we have brought that sort of back into alignment with what we're budgeted for in state fiscal year 25. So I think historically there has sometimes been concerns when DCYF asks for additional social work staff that we cannot fill those positions. And so I'm really highlighting this slide to show that we have really largely addressed some of those problems, and feel very confident in our ability to actually fill additional positions if given to us. You can go to the next slide. So how do we currently allocate these FTEs across all of our regions? So I think this is another thing that has been challenging for sometimes folks to be able to understand fully. So we take that pie, which is a set number of FTEs. Again, going back to, we don't get FTEs just because we have more kids in care. We only get FTEs as relates to what's going on with our screened-in intakes. So then we have to take that set pie and divide it up amongst our 6 regions. And we like to do that on the basis of data. And so what we have is a formula that we have developed over time and have looked at periodically, and we kind of keep returning to it as a reasonable formula for allocating staff. And it is weighted heavily on screened-in intakes, with the thinking that we really want to set up each region to be staffed for what's coming in the front door that they can't control. And then we have less weighting on some of these other data points. So we have screened-in intakes, we have open cases that are weighted at 15%, and then the number of children in out-of-home care also. And we look at all of these data points, and that is how we decide how to allocate staff between the 6 regions to attempt to allocate them fairly. We look at this data every year, and we'll reallocate staff between regions based upon changes in trends. So for example, some regions may have a really dramatic rise in their screened-in intakes, and we want to make sure that they're staffed appropriately for that. Unfortunately, it's a zero-sum game, so I want to go to the next slide. So you can see, again, we're taking a pie and dividing it. So the challenge is that when I have a region that potentially, quote unquote, needs more staff because we're seeing a change in trend, I am taking those FTEs from another region in order to give them to the region that's experiencing sort of more workload. And I think that can be challenging because, again, it doesn't always take into account fully that you may have a situation where some regions have like longer lengths of stay, more kids that are in out-of-home care because of that, and yet we're still shifting resources to another region based upon a change in screened-in intakes. I'll just note on here that we represent, not in the pie chart, but on the table, Region 7, which you might be like, what is Region 7? Region 7 is really a statewide region, and that's where we put staff that serve kind of the child welfare system as a whole. So for example, our state-run facilities where youth that are having instability in placement, all of the staff that run those state-run facilities are in that Region 7 category. So I just wanted to make sure that those are represented. And I see a question from Representative Dent.
Thank you. And I don't, full disclosure, I don't have a question. I just have to leave the meeting because we have other things to do here in the legislature. But thank you, everybody, and appreciate all the information that has come through here. Jenny, thank you for your hard work and, giving us as much information as you can. I know how difficult it can be. So looking forward to seeing you the next time. So everybody have a good day. Okay.
All right, we can move on to the next slide. So now I'm going to shift us to the new workload model, but I might pause there because I know I just threw a whole host of numbers at you. And so I want to just maybe pause and make sure that there's nothing about kind of how we operate today that people might have additional questions about. And I see a question from Shelley in the chat. Does this imply that those with higher numbers have greater workloads? And is this reflection of a high risk area? And again, I think that the challenge is that the way that we allocate staff across regions really doesn't take into account today individual workload experience. We're really weighting those investments on the side of what we're seeing around intakes. And you'll see issues like workload and risk sort of show up a little bit more in this new workload model, but I see a couple hands.
Ben?
Jenny, are you able to factor in vacancy rates? I know you've made great progress in lowering vacancy rates, but there are still areas, particularly in the rural areas, where they can't get fully staffed. And if they have chronic vacancies, that's a workload issue. Is there some way of trying to figure that out?
Certainly. So I think the question of vacancies is always a really interesting one because we can have a position that is created right? That in it, that is vacant, the person has left, right? But we ultimately don't have the funding for that. So that's why I sort of showed that chart with the blue and orange lines to show that as when we ended state fiscal year 25, we were expending all of the staff that we were funded for. And the caveat, right, is that in any given office, it may not feel that way, right? Because you have staff that are out on family medical leave, for example, are out on maternity leave at any given time. And so I think this has been the conundrum as we have worked through this, is how much are we watching this system sort of at that top statewide experience? And then there's the experience of individual workers, units, offices, and we're trying to keep an eye on both. And at the same time, we cannot be in a situation where we are filling our positions that we're not funded for, right? We can't go above our funded authority. So I think sometimes that's feels like a bit of a disconnect for our workforce, right? Is like, wait a second, how can you tell me we are quote unquote fully staffed, right? It doesn't feel that way. And I have positions that are being hired, but we are expending all of our resources. And I think, so one of the things that we're really working on that I think is leading to that sense around vacancies is we're seeing a real change in the pattern of leave usage by staff. We're seeing kind of higher leave usage, and that's across the board and across social health services agencies. I talked to my colleagues at Department of Corrections and DSHS, and they're having sort of the same experience. Lots of sick leave utilization. We also have now paid family medical leave and et cetera. And so the challenge, right, is that those staff, we still pay those staff, and those staff still cost us money even when they are not present to do work. And I think we're having a real conversation about how do we backfill positions when people are on leave, and how are we adequately funded for that? And that's not just a conversation for DCYF, that is a conversation happening holistically across health and human service agencies.
Do you know off the top of your head what the vacancy rate is now? The
I
last
don't
I saw, in 23, it was 26%. That's a quarter of the workforce, but I know it's much better than that now. I just don't know what it is.
Well, and again, I kind of go back to there's two pieces to that conversation, and we would definitely be happy to do sort of a deeper dive than we have time for today to get into this. But essentially, we are expending all of our FTEs at this point. So while there may be individual vacant positions across the state that we are advertising for, we don't have a large amount of additional resources. And that's what you kind of saw on that chart. We actually, in state fiscal year 24, were essentially over FTE, over our FTE limit at that point, and have been trying to come back into alignment. So if I look at my quote unquote vacancy rate, it may look a little high right now, but it was because I'm trying to come back into alignment with what I'm funded for.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Jenny, my question is, your model is based on quantitative data, correct? The number of intakes screened in, et cetera. Do you have any qualitative factors that figure into the model?
That is a great segue, I think, into what we were trying to accomplish with our new workload model. So yes, the downside of today's model, it is very driven based upon caseloads and not necessarily workload, right? And so we're really distinguishing that in this new model. Again, the pie doesn't sort of grow. We didn't have any ability to articulate what is the need that we might potentially have for additional staffing. And so I will get into kind of how we brought in qualitative data into the next model. So we can go to the next slide. There are just a couple things to sort of really highlight related to the workload study. So just overall, right, all of this is kind of a constantly moving target. So since we completed that original workload study, the time study, we've seen a 15.2% reduction in child welfare caseload statewide, which can be attributed to sort of a 4% decrease in open cases. And then we also saw an increase in case workers, a 13% increase, right? So cases were going down and additional staff was going up. And that's some of what was presented on that sort of slide. That said, we recognize that the complexity of these cases and the legal expectation associated with those cases has increased significantly during that same time period. So that's why I believe that, right, especially our workforce doesn't kind of feel the relief, quote unquote, of having fewer kids in care and more staff, is because we at that same time really increase the expectation set on these cases sort of simultaneously. And this is what this new workload model is trying to get at and resolve for. So the new model accounts for increased workload associated with cases in, as I mentioned before, we've had significant changes in policy around Indian Child Welfare Act, and not only in what that act requires, but which cases those attach to. They attach to far more cases than they used to, based upon those Supreme Court decisions that we saw. We also see, and essentially what we're trying to understand is, are some cases more complex than other cases? And how that shows up when we run math, when we do the math problem of this, is what we call case weighting. So this idea that a case is not a case is not a case. How do we somehow reflect in our math, essentially, that not all cases are equal? So we see case weighting proposed, and more significant case weighting proposed in Indian child welfare. We do currently weight Indian child welfare cases higher than a non-Indian child welfare case. And right now in our system, that doesn't mean that we get additional staff. So we can weight them, but if you don't get additional staff, it doesn't actually translate into any relief in the field. We also are recognizing that there is additional case complexity introduced when either the child or the parent and guardian has disabilities. And we are currently in a settlement agreement with the federal government around what services and supports we're offering to parents and guardians that have disabilities. So that, as you just can imagine, adds complexity and time that the caseworker has to spend with that family. We additionally call out that when a family has language interpretation or translation service needs, that increases the amount of time associated with tasks as well. When we have situations where, an important distinction, and I have a slide on this here in a minute, is that right now we sort of flip. So when you're in a child protective services investigation, family assessment response, or a family voluntary case, that case is counted as one, regardless of how many children are in the household. And so what was brought forward by staff, rightfully so, is that when we have one of those cases that has 3 or more children involved, victims that are allocated in those cases, we have more complexity. When the children are brought into care, so what we call Child Family Welfare Services CFWS case, that is counted on an individual child basis, even though if they're all associated with the same family. So we already handle that when we get deeper into our system, but we didn't have a good way of representing large families in terms of the impact to workload. Obviously, once we're going to where we are going to remove the child, many more steps come into the process. So we also reflect the fact that when we're moving into a removal, pursuing removal of the children, that will have case complexity. And lastly, this is not actually on the case complexity, but when we are calculating staff and the caseloads that staff can handle, we recognize that staff that have less than 3 years of tenure probably have to have lower caseloads. They just don't have the experience, right? And it also might take them longer to work individual components of the case. And so in our ideal world, in our new workload model, we would account for staff that have a lower tenure, and so that we can make sure that they don't have too many cases assigned to them. We can go to the next slide. So there's really 3 principal big shifts that are happening in this workload model that are different than how we do things today, that is driving the number of FTEs and additional FTE investment that the model suggests. One is that we have this thing that we call sort of the available hours to work. And right now, when we're running math about how many staff do we need, say, to implement a new piece of legislation, we assume that every worker has 174 hours a month to complete tasks. That is not accurate, and I will show you here in a minute about why that is not accurate. And so we are lowering the amount of hours that are available for staff to actually complete casework to recognize things like leave and training and other case consultation activities. And so I just want to point out that that's a pretty substantial change in assumption, and that drives a lot of the additional new staff investments that we're asking for. The second piece is that we do have these lower, and I use the word caseload ratios, but just because it's easier to run math on caseloads, but really those caseload ratios reflect the amount of time it actually takes to complete activities, case activities. And so we will go over those ratios here in a second. And then we also adjust the length of time that cases are open, right? Because we recognize, I think we were talking about those more complex families earlier, they take more time and we have to spend more time with them, right? We're not getting those families to a different place in 60 days. And so some of them, right, have longer cases are open longer. And then we also want, especially for our intake staff who are taking calls, we want to reflect the volume of calls, all the calls that they're taking, not just the screened in intakes, because our intake workers have to spend time with everyone who calls, regardless of whether or not that ultimately screens in. We can go to the next slide. So usable hours, I just want to kind of highlight, and you guys can, the board can certainly sit with this information for longer. And if you have additional questions later, we're happy to answer them. But essentially what we did was we take that 174 hours. So that 174 hours assumes essentially every single minute that you're at work, you can use for case activities. And we know that's not the case, right? Because, for example, we have state holidays. We have the ability to use leave, and we should be using leave. We have sick leave, right? That has to come in. So just when we account for holidays and leave utilization, we get from 174 usable hours to 146 usable hours for any given month. And then we take out some additional calculation for saying sometimes you have to spend some time at work not doing case specific, right? You're in a staff meeting, you're doing some required paperwork, those types of situations. And then the big one we also wanted to recognize was training time. So we offer a lot of training to staff and it's training opportunities. And what we hear from staff is that would be great. I don't have the time to engage in that training. And when we think about really an emphasis on quality and consistency and the types of quality assurance activities that we want to do, we need to be able to have carved out time for our staff to participate in training and learn new skills and keep their skills fresh. And that 174 hours that we assumed previously didn't allow for any of that. So it's no surprise that staff feel stressed around the ability to be able to participate in training activities. So you can see that we start with that 174 and ultimately get down to that number I showed you earlier, 124 usable hours in any given month for any given worker to actually be able to work on case-related activities. You need to know that, so then you could say, okay, workers have this amount of time available. Here's how much time every task takes. And the model ultimately spits out, here's how many workers you would actually need in order to handle the cases that you have and the amount of time that it's going to take, given how many usable hours our staff actually have to complete those tasks. We can go to the next slide. So this just compares essentially our current model to our new workload model. And sorry, it is small because I'm trying to provide a lot of information here potentially. So that first one is those available hours, which we just covered in detail. Then we sort of go into different case types, and what we're proposing should be the new essentially caseload workload assumption for those case types. For example, we talked about CPS earlier. We are currently funded, assuming that workers should receive no more than 8 new intakes every 30 days. This new model, when it actually looks at the amount of hours it takes to complete case tasks, reduces that to 6.4 new cases every 60 days for investigative workers and 7 new cases every 45 days for family assessment response workers, as an example. You also see a very substantial reduction in the number of cases that we would expect a family voluntary services or FVS worker to take. And that represents, again, that earlier conversation we were having around the complexity and risk associated with those family voluntary service cases, a real recognition of how much effort it is going to take a caseworker to work with that family. And additionally, note that those cases could represent multiple children in those cases. And then when we get to our child and family welfare services, extended foster care, and legally free and adoption workers, we are proposing those are per child or per youth counts per month that we have here. And you see reductions in those assumptions as well to really reflect the amount of time it is taking. I think I'm going to pause there again for a second, just because there's a lot of information on this before I sort of get into like what actually was getting funded, and just pause and see if there are additional questions at this moment on what is the workload model proposing. I see a question from Ben.
So, Jenny, I know this is very, very difficult to get at, but is there any way of turning the page from measuring everything that workers do to considering the things that they don't have to do but are currently doing? Because it's been my experience in bureaucracies that we add requirements much faster than we take them away. And over time, it's like weeding the garden, right? So adding more workers is one way to balance things out. But I'm sure you've thought of efficiencies that could be in place, like conservation of direct service time, for example. One study that I was involved in, we found that workers spent more time sick on various leaves and in training than they did in direct service time with their families they were working with, which is not a very efficient intervention model. But anyway, I'm sure that you're having those kinds of conversations internally. Anything to report out on that?
Yes, we are looking at that, and actually, we're in a process of looking at all of our policies right now, anyway, because we're in the process. We have all of our child welfare policies are public facing. I don't know who else besides myself on this board spends a bunch of time looking at our policy, but I have. And one of the things that we have is that we used to have sort of policies and procedures kind of blended together. You may have seen that, very long policies that were like, wait a second, some of this is policy and some of this looks like procedure. We've been going through a process of separating those two out, so the policies stand alone and the procedures stand alone, and so it's a little easier for our social workers caseworkers to digest. As part of that project, we are also looking at kind of like, where do we have the ability to maybe remove workload that we have either selected to do as a state for our own workforce, or where there has been actually legal requirements. And so one of the places we are in conversation, and I think you will see us be discussing this further and potentially will result in either in agency request legislation in the future, is to really think about, are there also statutory requirements that we have in place that we just don't think are actually resulting in an outcome, but result in a lot of workload associated. So absolutely, we have had those conversations because we are also quite sensitive to the fact that this workload model pops out a lot of additional staff that are potentially needed. So we want to make sure that we're doing what we can inside. And I'll just put my plug for our, we're funded to get a new IT system. So one of the things that we also recognize is that our current IT system creates a lot of work for workers, right? And so we're really actually quite excited to be able to revisit this workload model once we have our new system, which I can now announce is called ProFam. And we are working on that, but it will be a couple of years before that is in place. So I think that represents another place where we'll see savings associated with the workload model.
Thank you.
My question is, or comment is along the lines of Ben's, and you likely answered part of it with the announcement about the ProFam, because I see that this part of the report talked about more clerical support, so the social workers are not doing a lot of ministerial administrative work, which when in their testimony, I hear that a lot of time is being eaten up, that they would have preferred to be engaging in families or making referrals or finding referrals or finding services for families. Do you have any concrete things that you all are putting into place right now to remove some of that administrative load on social workers um, I mean, what did you have in mind, so to speak? Because I do hear from social workers that there's a lot of that, what I would consider to be clerical or administrative support type things that they're doing that takes away from the time that they can give to family.
Yes, I want to go back and we will definitely be able to provide in writing more examples. I normally would have had one of my colleagues, Adrian Franklin, here, who also is working on that project and worked on the workload project, so we can give you some more specific examples, I think, on that front. But typically, I think when IT investment that we're getting. I think I might be able to speak to something you're very familiar with, Judge Amil, is to say discovery, right, represents a significant activity that the agency engages in. And that's where you have seen us try to make investments in kind of more like clerical or dedicated staff who can do discovery, because a lot of times that has fallen on the backs of our caseworkers. And again, discovery is very important, and I would rather my caseworker work with families and not be sitting there redacting documents or pulling documents, etc. I do think that with a new technology system, it will be significantly easier for those documents to be created and discovery to happen using technology more than using the human factor right now, which is what we are very reliant on. So I'm very much looking forward to those kinds of efficiencies, and we will relook at the workload study and the need for things like clerical or discovery staff after we have implemented that new technology system. All right, I'm going to keep us moving forward here just to make sure we're staying on time for you all. So we could go to the next slide. So this new model, drum roll, right, it pops out and essentially represents the need for almost 360 additional FTE direct program staff. And in addition to that, would add an additional 66.3 FTEs that are really what we kind of call back office support. So that's human resources, information technology, people to pay the bills in our finance and business section. And so really we're talking about over 400 additional staff that we would believe we would need in order to actually be staffed for the amount of work that we have on the plate of caseworkers. That's a large number, and especially a large number in these kinds of budget times. So we represent that we would ramp this in. We would not be asking for over 400 staff in any given year, both because we recognize the constraints in our budget, but also in our own ability to hire and train additional staff. So we are proposing that we kind of implement this slowly over time. So our first bite of that apple was in this last year, as we talked about, fiscal year 2026. We're proposing to fund the investigative, family assessment response, intake, and family voluntary services social workers. And now we'll go to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brianne Boggs, to talk about what was actually funded in the governor's budget.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So the governor's proposed budget, it may look like partial funding, but I would actually say it pretty much fully funds what DCYF requested in fiscal year 26 and fiscal year 27. The slight difference in the number of FTE and the funding level is actually due to accounting for, at maintenance level, we receive CPS investigation, CPS FAR, back office workers, and central intake workers. So the governor's budget step removes the people that are showing up through our normal maintenance level process so that we're not double counting in some way. So that is why it looks slightly less, but I would call it pretty much close to fully funding what we asked for back in September. So what you see here, these are in full-time equivalent. So that's, that doesn't represent a head count of workers. It's if you have workers and you're taking into account how long, I've got 10 workers, but I'm hiring them in April, et cetera. So there's a proration that occurs. But just for simplicity of comparing across budgets, what you see here is 1.3 FTE hired in fiscal year 26, 23.6 in fiscal year 27, and then that is ramping up to 46 FTE in fiscal year 28 and ongoing. So over the course of those 2 years, we're ramping in batches of workers and ultimately being able to hire 46 new staff at full implementation. So Jenny mentioned on the previous slide that the workload model has a much larger number of workers that we're assuming we need to hire. And this governor's proposed budget step is a really good step toward working toward that funding level. And our original assumption is it could take up to 10 years to get up to that level. And we would be on track based on the funding level that you see in the governor's budget proposal.
Thank you, Brianne. I think we can go to I believe it's our final slide. Now, actually, I want to just take a moment. I won't read through this all, but I think you can imagine that the impact for caseworkers, right, can be significant in terms of the amount of time that they're able to engage with children, youth, and families, and what kind of impact that would have on outcomes. And then we can go to the next slide. So just next steps, if the governor's proposed budget item is approved, we would move forward with hiring those approved numbers of staff for fiscal year 26 and for 27. Be preparing for that and preparing for that hiring and those training requirements for new staff. We would submit future requests to complete funding of this new model over time, and then we would adjust the model based upon new requirements that we may get, new data, again, a new IT system, those types of things going forward. And that, and then I think we can go to the last slide, which is just our questions slide. And with that, we will take questions.
And I will just tell the group, I think we can easily go to 11 if we need to for questions, as long as that's okay with Jenny and Brianne. Okay, so go ahead. It looks like Judge Amamielo has a question.
Just that with the request for the new hires, does that include in addition to being able to fill any vacancies that you have right now?
Yes, we will absolutely continue to, our goal is always to spend all of our resources, right? So if we are funded for FTEs, we will continue to spend all of the FTEs that we have available to us. And I think, again, happy to continue to do deep dives on sort of our staff. I've spent a lot of time thinking about our staffing, and it can be quite complicated to show you the sort of full picture and also to really give the kind of, I think, full experience that we see for some of our caseworkers. So happy to kind of do deeper dives if needed, and with maybe a subset of the board if people have particular interest. But absolutely, we would continue to fill existing vacancies.
Thank you.
My question is about geographic variation. I know you had mentioned the different regions. I just wonder if there are any specific qualitative difference amongst the geographic areas that you've noticed. I'm thinking about like Region 1, which is ginormous, geographically versus maybe a smaller region. Are there other factors that you kind of think about in terms of just specific circumstances and areas of concern and workforce in parts of the state?
That's a great question. And I think that might be an area that we want to continue to look at as we look at this workload model over time. That could be sort of a next phase. We were really trying to land top line statewide. What is it taking to do these types of case activities that are required for us? What do we see in terms of case complexity, regardless of which region it shows up in? But we certainly, that's part of the reason why we did focus groups essentially in each region to understand if there were regional differences. And we're happy to, I'll have to go back and look at that information to see if something came forward. I think it can be tricky because in Region 1, what I hear from caseworkers is, yes, right, it can take me a long time to be in the car to go see a family, or I am actually providing more services because our rural network of providers is lower. The flip side is that if I go over to King County, I may also spend 2 hours in the car. It's just going a shorter distance, right? And so we want to really, that's why we were thoughtful about thinking about, case activities such as travel, such as moving, providing transportation either to clients or to foster youth, for example, can be activities that our caseworkers are doing, and we're trying to capture that in the workload. We have not gotten down to a regional level because we're really limiting that sort of statewide perspective, but I think it's an excellent question. We certainly do see differences, jurisdiction, region to region, county to county, jurisdictional differences in terms of the amount of workload associated, and that certainly could be a sort of a phase 2 further modification, refinement of this model.
Jenny, there's a question in the chat from Anna.
Yes. Provide hybrid provision. So we do currently allow our caseworkers to be essentially hybrid. We do have some requirements around in-person working in out of the office, essentially, especially when you're a new worker, and also sort of periodically throughout your week, because we recognize that one of the protections for sort of secondary trauma is being with other people that are doing that work, having access to your supervisor for support and those types of things, right? So we've got to find this sort of sweet spot on that. For other types of workers, for example, our intake workers, right, they could work largely from home. And some of our program managers, and again, kind of not sort of case carrying, forward facing staff, workers doing discovery, we find that those tasks translate super well to an working from home environment. And so we certainly offer hybrid positions and hybrids between in-office work and home office. And your split will depend on what type of task you're doing for us.
Pamela.
Jenny, does any of your guys' positions account for like the lived experience piece to it?
So one thing, and this is not in the workload study, but this is sort of a separate thing that is going on in state government in general right now. And again, happy to share more information about this. We have an executive order that requires us to be moving away from some of the sort of strict focus on education and certifications, right? And allows us to have kind of more flexibility and a push to look at a variety of life experience that potential workers could have for us. And so we are working on that across the board, and that's an across state government activity. So happy to share more information about what that looks like for DCYF in general, and then child welfare in specific. But certainly that's really more on the hiring side of the house. And again, we are happy to provide more information on that if that's helpful, but not really taken into account in the workload study.
Any other questions? Ben.
Jenny, how much authority do you have, flexibility to move positions around when you get the new influx? Do you have the authority to change their work assignments based on changing circumstances at the agency, or do you get categories of staff that you have to live with?
So it depends is the answer, right? So when we have for child protective service workers and intake workers that are currently part of a forecast, we have the ability to move those workers around the state, but not really the ability to move those workers to a different type of work, right? Because the legislature is funding us for them to do child protective services work. And so we want to ensure that we're using them for that particular type of work, right? The remainder of our staff we rely on our regional administrators and local supervision, area administrators, regional administrators, to be sort of constantly looking at how those resources inside of their region are allocated between programs, between offices, et cetera, right? And so we really rely on that. Again, I think what's been frustrating for staff sometimes is that, and I've seen this even with leadership, right, is that again, none of these pies have grown when we get more families, more responsibility, more work, etc. There's not an automatic way for that to happen. And so I think sometimes, especially when I look at how do we, that's why I kind of covered how do we currently allocate staff between regions. I think there's sometimes a frustration, right? Of like, wait a second, I have a whole bunch of intakes happening, in Region 6, which means I have to take those staff, right, from Region 1 example, and move them over to 6, even though 1 hasn't necessarily had an appreciable change in work, right? Because I'm essentially dealing with a zero-sum game. And so what we've really been hoping to sort of show in this workload model is here's the number of staff we would actually need, and we could run that math all the time based upon how many actual cases we're seeing, of what types, et cetera, and then have requests that reflect that more fully, I think. So that's really how that works today is we do have quite a bit of flexibility, unless particular FTEs, we've had this before. Typically, when we see new investment of FTEs, there is a proviso that goes along with those FTEs that says must be used for, whatever purpose, right? Discovery workers, qualified expert witness workers, those types of things. When we have that in place, we must only use those FTEs for those explicit purposes.
I see. Right. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Doesn't look like it. So with that, I really want to thank Jenny and Brianne for spending time with us this morning. Jenny, you've been here for a while and talking for a while, so we certainly appreciate your willingness to come in. Everybody gets a 10-minute break. So why don't we plan on coming back right at 11:10? And for the public commenters, we will make sure you have all of your time. So don't worry, we aren't going to give you short shift. All right, see everybody at 11:10. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to now move to our public comment portion of the meeting. After I read the board's public comment statement, I will invite each speaker by name to unmute and speak. Please note that we have an on-screen timer, which will show you the remaining time for your comment. So now the public comment statement. The DCYF Oversight Board operates under state law, which outlines its authority and responsibilities. Specifically, the board is responsible for monitoring DCYF's progress towards achieving outcome measures, ensuring DCYF's compliance with applicable laws and policies, overseeing DCYF's performance and policies, and offering advice and input to DCYF, the legislature, and the governor. While the board may consider information brought to its attention as part of its general oversight and monitoring role, it does not have the authority to investigate, direct, or alter DCYF's decision in individual cases. Additionally, during public comment periods, neither the board nor meeting presenters can respond to comments beyond a simple acknowledgement. All public comments related to DCYF will be compiled and sent to DCYF leadership following the board meeting. To respect individuals who may have sensitive stories to share or wish to discuss details of individual cases, we'd like to remind you that the board is subject to the Open Public Meetings Act. This means that our meetings are open to the public, recorded, posted on the Oversight Board's website, and live streamed on TVW. Written public comments submitted in advance have been sent to the board members, and we had one such written comment that has been submitted to the board members to date. To ensure that we hear from as many individuals as possible, please keep comments to 3 minutes or less. Thank you. Okay, our first public commenter is Danny Fogel.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Danny.
Excellent. Good afternoon. My name is Danny Forgy, and I'm a represented WFC union member. I have been a social worker with DCYF for over 6 years. And in July 2023, a new implementation of assignment pay was awarded to some social workers, which is what I will be focusing on today. According to DCYF from a current job posting, assignment pay is in addition to the regular base salary. The required duties include performing visits in unregulated environments, such as private residences, to conduct investigations for allegations of abuse and/or neglect to assess the safety of vulnerable children. As someone who transitioned to another CFWS role in adoptions in July 2023 to support legally free youth in reaching permanency, I am not qualified to receive assignment pay. In my role, I continue to go into unregulated environments. I am consistently conducting assessments for the safety of vulnerable children. In my region, we also support extended foster care, which is youth ages 18 to 21 who have quote unquote aged out of the foster care system without reaching permanency. These youth are often living in the riskiest, unregulated environments. In adoptions, we hold the highest concentration of behavioral rehabilitative services youth. These youth can be combative, threaten us, or assault us. We are the legal guardians for these youth and are required to support them. This includes meeting with them privately, as needed per policy, or even transporting them to another placement when one disrupts. I implore the legislature to extend assignment pay for case-carrying SSS2s and SSS3s to include adoption workers, EFC workers, and missing from care workers. Some of these positions are awarded assignment pay in other offices or regions. However, there is no unilateral commitment to recognizing the work we do and paying us what we are worth. It doesn't make any sense why one social worker in Region 1 who is performing adoptions is receiving assignment pay when I am in Region 4 performing adoptions and am not receiving assignment pay. We continue to perform the same level of work outlined under assignment pay. Withholding assignment pay from some staff sends a message that my work in supporting my youth is worth 10% less than my counterparts for no legitimate reason. I continue to be a CFWS worker in an adoptions role, but now that I serve legally free youth, I've been abandoned by DCYF, OFM, and the legislature from valuing the work I do with our most vulnerable and marginalized youth. Frankly, I'm tired of the fact that I have had to spend so much time advocating in so many spaces to be paid for what I'm worth. I could instead be focusing these additional efforts improving outcomes for communities, but here I am, and here I will continue to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny, and I'm sorry I got your name incorrect at the start.
That's okay.
The next person that we have giving public comment today is Jamie Williams.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to hopefully it's nice for you to put a face to a name. I'm able to be here in Olympia today and pretty excited about that. I want to just to quickly give you a reminder of who I am. I'm from Walla Walla. I am a foster parent. I have been for 7 years. I'm also a registered nurse who spent most of my career in labor and delivery, caring for a lot of these infants that we are seeing die or nearly die at wild rates. So I'm going to dive right in because I have a lot of information to present to you today. I've had a chance to review the bills that have dropped. I do believe that Travis Courteur's is the most robust bill that will really get us leading in the right direction. I've also met with Representative Rule, and I feel like with some amendments there, this also could be a step in the right direction. Fostering change, we have also dropped our own bill and kind of taken matters into our own hands. We have really dialed it down to address the problematic language of imminent physical harm. So we feel very proud about that. I have had a chance to review Lillian's bill. She just dropped it, I think, yesterday, so not as in depth, but from what I can tell, I feel that this would be a Band-Aid on a hemorrhaging wound, and we have to stop doing that. It's more services that we cannot fund, we cannot staff. As we all know, we are over 400 caseworkers short in this state. And although this looks great on paper, this is not going to apply into the real world setting in a way that's going to make any change or move the needle for us. What I want to also kind of address today is Senator Christian. I believe you asked a really good question at the last meeting, and that is, what are other states doing? How are we comparing? And I think that's a really important question to ask, and I've actually had the time to kind of dial into this. In Colorado is a really interesting case study. I just am going to show you this graph because you can't really can't really see it that much, but I just want you to guess which one's Washington in terms of critical incidents and near fatalities and fatalities. Okay, we are 70% higher in critical incidents than Colorado, and I just want to kind of read the different terminology in the laws and how it compares to Washington. So for legal threshold for removal, Washington, we have to prove imminent physical harm, and we know how important those words are and how hard they are to prove. In Colorado, it is more of a probable cause and serious risk framework. For substance abuse in Washington, it's not sufficient. In Colorado, it is recognized as neglect. For drug-exposed infants, which is really where my heart is, in Washington State, we just apply services and throw up a Hail Mary. And in Colorado, it triggers an immediate protective custody response. And it goes deeper into that, but I'm out of time. So if you want any more information about that, Lisha can give you my contact information, and I would love to just share this data with you because I really think that this needs to be what we're looking at to move in the right direction. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Jamie. You could always submit that data as a written comment and we can circulate it to the board. Let's see. I see your hand, Senator Christian, and we're not set up right now to take questions. So maybe you could hold it to the end of this and then maybe we can.
It was just a comment that she could come over to my office is all I was going to say after the meeting or if she's done and have a conversation with me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
We can text her. Yeah.
Okay. This looks like, is this Matthew Van Leeuwen? Did I get your name correct?
Okay. Yeah, my name is Matthijs van Leeuwen.
Oh, not quite.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity actually to make a public comment. I also have provided the board with some information beforehand because obviously I wouldn't be able to cover everything that I want to say actually in 3 minutes. My wife and myself have been involved in the caretaking of a born fentanyl-addicted baby, and that has caused all around the family quite some stress. And I've written actually a book about that, and the book is called Trapped. And I know you're probably not looking at individual cases, but I can only recommend you to really read it to get an idea about what actually can happen. And we were basically, from the start, already confronted with a child fatality of a child from a friend of the parents. And the parents had a fentanyl addiction. And obviously, the child of the friend died through that course. And then I've been looking into cases to see what is happening. And myself actually being in consumer product design, I know what kind of happens whenever you make something and, there's a fatality happening. And, there's a whole different process that takes place to prevent things in the future. When I see the way how these fatality reports are created, and usually no findings, and we go on to the next one. And I believe that especially when it comes to substance abuse and it comes to those fentanyl addiction, actually these deaths are preventable. And that's why I've been giving a lot of recommendations. I've spent one chapter actually in this book giving recommendations, and I'm also preparing a new book where I kind of lay out, well, this first book is basically about our individual case. In the second book, actually, I'm laying out to show the impact of the decisions that were made by DCYF on the lives afterward. And I've actually given you kind of a draft of an epilogue of that book, which includes a lot of recommendations about, how you can actually prevent them. And it was interesting that I'm hearing actually the comments from the previous public commentator that actually makes differences between how the laws are made here versus in another state. And I know that's where the first thing we basically have to look at is a lot of how we have drafted our legislation, what impact it will have on the children and the child fatalities we have to deal with. I'm running out of my time. I'm just also saying you, I hope you read my book. I hope you read actually the epilogue that I gave you of the new book, just to get you an idea about what's going on. And thanks for the time.
Thank you so much for coming in person and presenting your comment today. Let's see, the next person we have is Christina Johnson. I recognize you, Christina. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thank you for letting me speak once again. I'm from Keeping Kids Safe. We were in Olympia. We had a great rally yesterday. We were able to show pictures of some of the children, not all of them because there are so many, and talk about some of what has happened and how their cases were preventable. And so we want change. And so we want to remove the word imminent and recognize other forms of harm besides physical, such as neglect. We want situations of illegal substance abuse, and when caregivers or when parents don't engage in services must equal serious risk of harm. So I'm a service provider, and if the parents close the door, then the CPS has to close the case. And that is what is happening. In Seattle Times, it said 68% of the fatalities were families that refused services. So services is good, right? So I'm a service provider, and I encourage that, but it can't be the only answer. And if it's not funded, there is no other answer to that. So the answer is to change the law, and to provide resources to the frontline social workers. We have the support of the Social Workers Union. We are supporting them in any way we can because we know how important their job is, and they need that support. And we recognize the value of stability and attachment to both relatives and non-relative caregivers. So we just want to encourage the people who listen to the Oversight Board is to take steps. So there are a lot of bills. I have them all printed out. There's quite a few. And so you need to contact your reps. You need to contact your Democratic reps. So this is not about Republican or Democrat. This is about child safety. But they need to hear the stories. We've been meeting with legislators while we're here. And, a lot of you probably heard about the 9-year-old intent in Seattle. She hadn't. So many of these representatives are so busy, and so they haven't heard these stories. So please, if you're a foster parent, if you're a home provider, if you're a business supervisor, you work and you do the actual work, please call your legislators and tell them the stories. When these bills hit, they need testimony. They need you to tell, and they need you to comment on the bills, and you need to stay involved. Because this law right now is hurting families. These are some of the kids that we were sharing about. So I just want to say that our rally yesterday was just the starting place to bring attention and to call everybody to action. We can't sit back and be silent, and that is why I'm here.
Thank you very much, Christina, for coming in today. Appreciate your public comment. Colleen Stark is next.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Colleen Stark-Bell. I'm a WFC member from Local 899, and I'm also an extended foster care social worker within King County. I've been with DCYF for 9 years, working in areas including family treatment court, CFWS, as a social and health programs coordinator, and now as an EFC social worker. I've been doing the EFC role since 2022 when King County moved to creating an EFC specialty unit. Out of all of my roles at DCYF, EFC has been by far the most challenging and overwhelming, but for me, one of the most important and critical. In my years at DCYF, I have not worked in a division like EFC that has led to social workers experiencing significant and direct vicarious trauma, safety issues, but also objectively comes with fewer supports and resources or equitable pay in order to be able to do the work properly for our most vulnerable youth. We know that data across the nation on how these youth fare both during and after their time in child welfare systems, even if they participate in EFC, is troubling. We should all be heartbroken and ashamed that we are allowing this to happen. I want to bring visibility to how even within our child welfare system, this population of youth often seems to be a lower focus and priority to the agency, community, and legislators, especially when it comes to resources and funding. Often, legislators in the agency inadvertently exacerbate the challenges we face as social workers by pushing for legislation that excludes the voices and expertise of staff who are doing the work and almost always comes with insufficient funding. In 2024, EFC-specific legislation was passed, Senate Bill 5908. It was a bill that sounded positive and helpful on the surface, but the nuance and complexity of what it would take to truly meet the goals of that legislation were not discussed or considered. More critically, that legislation was underfunded. All of the concerns and adverse unintended consequences that myself and my EFC colleagues attempted to share with legislators in our own agency have come to fruition, but were ignored at the time. We knew that that funding would be shortchanged and that our workload would explode with no resources. There are some bright spots that came from that legislation. It required a follow-up co-design process that brought together youth with lived experience, EFC workers, and stakeholders. What the youth would learn was that EFC workers are paid 10% less than their counterparts, and that we have far fewer resources, training, and support. The reality is this has made our youth feel 10% less valuable, and EFC workers feel 10% less valuable. There are other sectors such as adoptions, missing from care, or family voluntary services who are also left out of assignment pay. The DCYF and OFM has engaged in a shell game of constantly changing the reasoning that social workers like myself serving our vulnerable youth deserve less pay. I ask and urge those sitting on this board to ask those questions why, and to make sure that all case-carrying workers who are doing important and critical work for our most vulnerable children, youth, and families are paid equally and fairly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Appreciate you coming in today. Our last public comment is Amy Parks.
Hi, thank you for letting me speak. I had the pleasure of attending the memorial for Sue Jin Han, who was beaten to death in Federal Way. I met her siblings, who were not only murder witnesses, but abused and tortured alongside their sister. And I'm going to read this on behalf of their family member. My name is Jody Sampson. I am sharing my testimony today because Washington State had repeated documented opportunities to protect a child and did not. This child is Sue Jin Han. While we were not related by blood, I am one of the few family members to ever visit the home. I am the aunt to the 3 remaining children who were neglected, tortured, and abused. My husband and I were able to take them in once DCYF finally removed them as a result of Sue Jin's death. This testimony is grounded in the Department of Children, Youth, and Families' own child fatality review of Sue Jin Han. According to that report, DCYF had years of involvement with this family, my family. There were multiple reports of physical abuse, documented domestic violence, and admitted use of physical discipline with a weapon. CPS was actively involved as recently as April 2025, just 1 month before Sue Jin was killed. During that final open case, children disclosed being hit. The father admitted to striking the children with a bamboo stick. Law enforcement had previously responded to domestic violence. Sue Jin was a medically complex, nonverbal child with unmet developmental needs. A visible facial bruise was observed on Sue Jin during a home visit and accepted as accidental. The family declined services, and the case was still closed. The CFR confirms the children were assessed as safe despite being classified as moderately high risk and despite a long history of prior CPS involvement that was not consistently integrated into new assessments. On May 29th, 2025, Sue Jin Han died from the injuries that the first responders identified as consistent with physical abuse. Her father was arrested, and CPS later issued founded findings of physical abuse against both caregivers. This was not a lack of information. This was not a lack of warning. This was a system that constrained itself from acting. When laws and policies discourage decisive intervention, even when abuse is disclosed, documented, and repeated, children are left to bear the consequences. I am asking this legislature to confront what this case shows us, that repeated abuse can be reframed as resolved, that parental assurances can outweigh observable harm, that cases can be closed even when risk remains high. House Bill 1227 and related policy shifts must be urgently reviewed and amended to ensure child safety is the primary, not secondary consideration. Please do not let Sujin Han's death be treated as an anomaly. It is a warning written clearly in your own records. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Amy. We appreciate all our public commenters, their passion and willingness to come forward and testify in front of us does not go unrecognized. And again, all of the comments will be sent over to DCYF. Okay. Now I'm going to pass it along to Laisha, who is going to guide us through our debrief. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. So I also want to thank the public commenters who are here today and who participated virtually. So I'm going to just lead us in a little bit of a meeting debrief and just want to can I ask some questions maybe to kick it off? So I'm curious about what board members felt was most important to them today. What really rose to the top for you? Also, what would you like more information about? I know throughout I've been jotting down notes, but happy to hear more about what we can be providing. Also, any questions about next steps? So those are some possible questions, but feel free to make any comments or questions now, and I'll see if anyone wants to kick it off. Ruth.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful to have the data that was basically requested during the presentation on child welfare incidents. I understand there has been a pretty significant reduction in the number of incidents. And I think it would be helpful to see the pattern of critical incidents over the last 5 years and juxtapose that against the legislative changes so we can kind of get a sense of whether or not, I mean, as Ben said, he did not think that the number of incidences have, I'm not sure I understood him totally, but I think we need the data to really determine if things continue to go in a direction that is alarming or if they are actually getting better. And we need to give more time for these laws to be fully integrated into the casework model.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth. I agree. We do need to see those data. I see Anna's arm is raised, hand is raised. Anna.
Hi, I was just wondering, I know that we had voted on changing our name from oversight to accountability. How soon is that going to be implemented?
That is a great question. So there was a hearing yesterday morning at about 8 a.m. in the Senate Human Services Committee, and we had one person testify, and I will be providing, or Nicholas will be providing, an update about where that bill is out. But it was discussed just yesterday, and so I can provide an update about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Ben, I see your hand as well.
I just wanted to tag on with the comments that Ruth made. I think it's so important for us all to be clear that nobody is disputing that there's been a rise in critical incidents. I think where it's controversial is that very rarely do you see a trend like that that's attributable to only one thing. And I think getting the data is important, but we have to also collect data on lots of things that might have a bearing on the rise of critical incidents. And there are a lot of them. It isn't just simply one change that the legislature made. So again, I would also, for our deliberation, separate critical incidents from fatalities because they both offer very, very different trend lines. And I think we should set some time in the future to work with DCYF to really think about and look at what they're learning as we go through this.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Some really important distinctions. I also agree time would be helpful. Judge Amamilo.
Yes, I'd just like to expand a little bit on my experience in reading hundreds and hundreds of petitions. That's why the question is so important to me. The data is so important to me because when I'm reading petitions that I sign and say, yes, you're going to get this pickup order, and I see a history that goes back, I mean, much longer than 60 days, year or two, working with the same family, even with a family that had a prior dependency, I'm wondering what was happening in between. Why did it take until this thing now? And I mean, and I'm a former parent defense attorney. And I'm looking at these things going, what is happening in between? And when I hear when I hear presentations that talk about the social workers, staff with their supervisors, and then after that they then do a consult with the AG and they are determining whether or not they think they have enough. There doesn't appear to be any uniformity in when they've come to the end of their policy process, right? I don't know if there needs to be a conversation about when and how much time they have to make that decision. And if the issue hasn't been addressed, that is when they need to bring it to the court. Because if it doesn't come to the court, I can't sign an order in absentia if I don't ever see it. But I do often wonder what has happened in between. Where do we have all of this long history, especially on the chronic neglect ones? It's very alarming. I mean, if you have a recent first time high potency synthetic opioid, that's different. But when you have those long history ones, I've often wondered what is this process for these safe child consults and how far along do they go? They sounded like there isn't a uniform time frame for when they decide this is, after 60 days, we go another 90 days, then we go to court. It doesn't sound like there's any sort of uniformity around it. And so I think some sort of query, a study, or data that would tell us at least figure out what the trend is and figure out if that's tolerable or not, if that's too long a time period for certain types of cases.
Really great questions, Judge Amamilo. Thank you for those comments. Shelley, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you. First, thank you for this opportunity. It is information that I truly value and use in my work daily and appreciate it. But I also agree with Ruth and Benjamin, and I would love to see more data provided to us. And if possible, by region, and I know they pull out some of those, they're reluctant to do that because there might be identifiers in some of the smaller communities. However, trends in rural locations or in neglect or opioid use would be super helpful to know how to best allocate resources and where it would help me better understand some of the barriers that we're facing. And I'm still new here and learning, but I'd love to see equitable presentations on the prevention side. And are we investing in those steps? I hear a lot about CPS and the wonderful strategies that are being employed, but I'd like to see just as much fortitude on the prevention side.
Great. Thank you, Shelley. And I'm hearing the request for data loud and clear, so I really appreciate people mentioning that. Co-Chair Levy.
Thanks. I still feel like I'm very murky about the monitoring process that goes on in DCYF in terms of, in particular, the families that choose the voluntary services who then disengage And then what kind of monitoring happens? You hear several times that once the parent closes the door while they're out of services, is that really what's happening? And are we missing? That's one part that continues to kind of stick with me. In my mind, if you choose voluntary services and you disengage or you fall out, that should be a red flag. And that should come back to somebody's attention, somebody who's monitoring. So I would like to see a little bit more about that monitoring piece, and making sure that, and this kind of speaks also to the chronicity of families, correct? I agree with all of the rest of you. We need to see the data. And in my mind, I was mentioning an algorithm. I kind of see where are the points on the decision points, the inflection points, where are the decisions, how many decisions go which way, and what happens. I guess that's the medical person in me. We all have algorithms to follow. What happens if they choose one direction or the other direction? So that's just kind of what's been stewing in my brain.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Just a chart of decision points, the inflection points, and really understanding the monitoring process better. Thank you for mentioning that. So board members, I also want to let you know that I don't have access to my laptop right now. So if there are comments in chat, I am not able to see them. So feel free to come off mute and I can take down some notes.
There is a question in the chat. Thank you for reminding us, Lisha, from Lois. Lois, did you want to say, or do you want me to just run it through it?
It's just a follow-up question. Just I think as we're looking at the data, how does leadership ensure consistent policy coherence across regions?
Yep. I think there's definitely a desire among board members to really understand what's happening at the regional level. So thank you, Lois. Any other last comments, things people want to elevate for other board members? Okay, well, with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Dr. Levy.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate everybody's willingness to attend. I know it's a difficult time, especially for our legislators, to get to this meeting during session, and I know that there's a lot going on. So I appreciate everybody's attendance. I feel that this meeting, to me, we've heard a lot about, especially the child welfare safety concerns. So I feel like we're getting to kind of the crux of the matter. And I'm looking forward to the next meeting where we can get into even more detail about that. I guess what I would mention is feel free, I speak as the co-chair, one of the co-chairs, in putting your questions to us after the meeting or your thoughts. We spend a lot of effort in trying to coalesce around what are the board's concerns and questions and use your expertise. So please feel free to reach out if you have a burning question or thought, or you would like us to get more information about anything in specific. Please feel free to forward this to us. But otherwise, thank you all for a great meeting. I don't know if anybody has anything else. We can adjourn a little bit early. Look at that, 15 minutes early. Lisha, anything else from you?
No, not from me.
Okay. And I see there is one last question here. Lois, did we stay within quorum after Representative Dent left? Or I think we're...
I believe we did. Quorum is 9, and so I think we're good.
Okay, that's good. Well, thank you all again. We'll see you next month. I think, well, actually, the next scheduled meeting is March 19th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Sorry, so it's not February, that's a March meeting. Okay, thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everyone.